talking about here on my channel right now. It's all about Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively's.
In the high-stakes world of Hollywood, where reputations are as fragile as glass and careers can rise or collapse overnight, a storm has been gathering in the courtroom, one that could redefine not only the trajectory of two of its brightest stars, but also the very limits of how law and publicity intertwine. And at the center of this maelstrom is Blake Lively, the actress adored for her wit, charm, and golden image, and Justin Baldoni, the actor and filmmaker who has reinvented himself as a creative force determined to control the narrative. But now, rather than sharing a red carpet, they are sharing a battlefield of legal filings, whispered allegations, and headline-making courtroom maneuvers. And the latest twist in their unfolding saga is perhaps the most devastating yet, because Baldoni's legal team has decided not to wait for the theater of a drawn-out trial with witnesses, documents, and dramatic testimonies, but to strike now, in the earliest stages, by filing a motion so cold, so technical, that it could cut off Blake Lively's case before it even draws breath. A move known in legal circles as a motion for judgment on the pleadings, and in plain language, it is the courtroom equivalent of demanding the referee blow the final whistle before the first ball has even been kicked, because the lawyers are essentially saying, even if every single word in Blake's complaint is accepted as true, even if we give her the benefit of the doubt on every detail, it still does not amount to a legal claim. And if the judge agrees, the case does not stumble, it dies, and not just in this form but forever, because Baldoni's team is not asking for a dismissal without prejudice, which would allow Lively to refile or revise her arguments, but for dismissal with prejudice, which is the harshest outcome available at this stage, locking the courthouse doors permanently, ensuring she cannot bring the same claim again. An irreversible blow that would silence her allegations before they are ever aired in full view of the public. And the stakes here could not be more dramatic, because while most people imagine lawsuits as months or years of bitter back and forths, witnesses breaking down under questioning, leaked evidence, and shocking revelations, the truth is that courts often operate in far more technical ways. And one small but surgical filing can erase entire cases from existence, which is exactly what Baldoni's lawyers are betting on, that the judge will look only at the papers in front of him, the complaint filed by Blake, the responses entered by Baldoni's side, and decide that even on their face, the allegations are insufficient, which means no discovery, no witness testimony, no emails, no text messages, no sworn statements, and most importantly, none of the secrets the public is desperate to know, because if this motion succeeds, everything remains locked away. The rumors continue to swirl but are never tested in the crucible of cross-examination. And Blake Lively, despite her stature, would stand not as a wronged employee seeking justice, but as someone whose claims were tossed aside at the very threshold. An image that could haunt her career far more than losing after a trial, because at least then she would have had her day in court. But being denied that chance altogether makes it appear as if her arguments never had merit to begin with, which is precisely why this maneuver is so lethal, and Baldoni's lawyers know it, which is why they have gone all in, framing their filing in the starkest terms, saying in effect, there is no case here, not now, not ever, and adding the ultimate sting by asking that this judgment carry the full weight of finality, with prejudice, closing every door for good. And so the question arises, what exactly are they relying on? What is this technical trap being laid before the judge? And why is geography, of all things, suddenly the central axis on which this entire Hollywood scandal might turn? The answer lies in the quirks of American labor law, where each state writes its own definitions of what constitutes retaliation, harassment, and protected activity, and where Blake Lively chose to file her case may now decide whether it lives or dies, because she filed in California, a state renowned for its expansive worker protections, with laws that cover a wide range of conduct and make it easier for plaintiffs to bring retaliation claims. But Baldoni's team argues that the bulk of the alleged events did not occur in California at all, pointing instead to New York and New Jersey, where the scope of retaliation is far narrower, and the requirements for proving a claim are stricter, which matters profoundly, because if the judge rules California law applies, then Blake may have an argument, but if New York law governs, her claims may not even meet the threshold, and here lies the razor's edge, because this case is not simply about whether certain actions happened but about which state's rulebook decides how those actions are interpreted, like a football match in which one referee blows the whistle for almost any foul, while another allows play to continue unless the most blatant violations occur, and the outcome of the game hinges not on the players, but on which referee has the whistle, and Baldoni's team insists the referee must be New York, while Blake's camp clings to California, knowing full well that her case is stronger there, and this is where the legal chess match becomes more than just paperwork, because California has procedural steps that plaintiffs often must complete before filing suit, such as lodging a claim with a labor board, and Baldoni's lawyers are arguing that she skipped these requirements. Which means that even if California law applied, her case could collapse instantly, while under New York law, many of the actions she describes would not even count as retaliation at all, meaning the judge could dismiss outright. So either way, she stands on dangerous ground, her entire claim perched precariously on technicalities rather than sweeping narratives of injustice. And this is precisely why Baldoni's legal team has seized the moment, pressing hard with their motion for judgment on the pleadings, because they know that if the judge accepts their framing, Blake's lawsuit will be not only dismissed but buried, never to be resurrected. And that outcome would have a chilling effect on any future attempts by stars or insiders to challenge the machinery of Hollywood publicity, because it would send a clear signal. Even if you are a household name, even if you can command headlines, the courtroom is not a stage for drama, unless you clear every procedural hurdle and every definitional requirement. And so the spectacle we are witnessing is not just Blake versus Justin but California versus New York, broad protection versus narrow interpretation, expansive definitions versus restrictive ones. And in that collision lies the future of this entire lawsuit, because what the public craves, those secret text messages, those behind-the-scenes accounts, those whispered PR strategies, may never see daylight if the judge rules now that no claim exists on paper, and it is this possibility, the silencing of the case before it begins, that makes the current moment so tense, because while the tabloids are hungry for scandal, the law operates in cold, unforgiving terms, reducing drama to definitions, headlines to technicalities, and careers to commas in legal codes. And as the judge weighs the arguments, the question is not whether Blake was wronged or Justin retaliated, but whether the words on the page align with the strict categories of a statute, which is why this motion is perhaps the most ruthless move in the legal arsenal, and why, if it succeeds, Blake Lively's fight ends not in the blaze of testimony but in the whisper of a gavel, her story cut short not by disbelief but by disqualification, a fate arguably crueler than losing outright, because it denies her the theater she sought, leaving the world forever wondering what might have come out had the case been allowed to unfold. This courtroom saga was about the cold precision of legal maneuvers, statutes, and jurisdictional chess. Part 2 plunges us directly into the fiery heart of Hollywood itself, where perception is currency, where image is weaponized, and where the line between clever publicity and malicious retaliation is so thin that it can bend and snap in the flicker of a headline. And it is within this contested space that Blake Lively insists she has been wronged, claiming that what she endured was not merely the ordinary noise of celebrity gossip, but a calculated campaign to undermine her, to punish her for daring to assert her rights, while Justin Baldoni's lawyers counter fiercely that nothing about the media narrative was unusual, that it was, in fact, textbook studio marketing, the kind of spin and storytelling that has propelled Hollywood projects for generations. And so the question becomes, was Blake the victim of a smear, or was she simply swept up in the relentless machine of film publicity, a machine that chews up stories, inflates drama, and feeds it to the tabloids with the sole aim of boosting ticket sales, because on the surface the two may look identical, but in the eyes of the law, they are worlds apart. And this razor-sharp distinction now defines the battleground, because if the judge sees the statements, the interviews, and the negative buzz as routine PR, then Baldoni's team wins, the retaliation claim collapses, and Blake is left with nothing, but if even a hint of personal vendetta, of deliberate punishment, of intentional malice can be traced within those headlines and whispers, then suddenly her case gains new strength, because retaliation, by its very nature, requires intent, a purpose to harm, and if the court accepts that intent can be cloaked in the language of marketing, then the entire industry may find itself vulnerable in ways it has never faced before. To understand why this argument matters so deeply, we need to step back and consider how Hollywood has long thrived on the symbiosis between scandal and sales, because for decades publicists have known that nothing drives coverage like controversy, and so they nudge, hint, and sometimes outright stage incidents to keep their stars in the spotlight, knowing full well that a story about a feud, a diva moment, or a clash on set will reach far wider audiences than a bland press release ever could. And within this environment, it becomes nearly impossible to distinguish between a smear campaign and a marketing stunt, because the same tactics are used for both: controlled leaks, suggestive sound bites, carefully timed stories planted in friendly outlets. And so Blake's accusation that what was done to her was not business but punishment cuts straight to the core of the system, because if she is right, then the industry practice of stirring up gossip may not only be ethically questionable but legally actionable, a possibility that terrifies studios, actors, and publicists alike, for it would mean the very fuel that drives so much of Hollywood's attention economy could now be seen as retaliation in a court of law. Blake frames her experience as a hit job, a coordinated effort to paint her as unprofessional, difficult, and disloyal. And she argues that this was not coincidental timing, but the deliberate choice of Baldoni and his team to retaliate against her, to damage her standing in the industry by seeding stories that questioned her professionalism and her reliability. And she points to the sudden surge of negative coverage that emerged precisely at the moment she began to assert herself legally. A correlation she insists is no accident, while Baldoni's side remains unmoved, dismissing this as paranoid misreading, saying instead that the stories were nothing more than the usual noise that accompanies any major production, and that far from retaliation, they were simply the byproduct of Hollywood's relentless hype machine, which thrives on conflict as narrative and gossip as promotion. And in their telling, these headlines were not aimed at punishing Blake, but at selling tickets, driving engagement, and building buzz, in other words, just business. And here is where the legal tightrope grows taut, because American courts place extraordinary weight on free speech protections, especially when it comes to statements made in the context of publicity and media, and Baldoni's team argues forcefully that the very statements Blake complains of are shielded under the First Amendment, that they constitute protected opinion, promotional speech, or fair comment, and that to allow her to label them as retaliation would be to open the floodgates to endless lawsuits every time a star feels bruised by bad press during a film campaign, a scenario that would cripple the industry's publicity machine. And judges, cautious by nature, often hesitate to tread on free speech, knowing the constitutional stakes, which means Blake's claim faces not only the skepticism of opposing counsel, but the inertia of legal tradition itself, because courts have long been reluctant to call publicity retaliation, unless the evidence of intent to harm is overwhelming. Yet at the same time, if the judge leans too far towards the free speech argument, it risks creating a loophole so wide that any retaliation could be disguised as PR, allowing powerful players to punish dissenters under the mask of publicity campaigns. A chilling thought that underscores why this case matters far beyond the personal feud between two celebrities, for it raises the broader question of where the boundary lies between promotion and persecution, and whether Hollywood has been hiding malice behind marketing all along. In this context, every leaked story, every snide remark, every cryptic post takes on outsized significance, because they could be read one of two ways, either as harmless promotional spin, or as sharpened arrows aimed squarely at Blake's reputation. And the judge must decide which interpretation carries the greater weight, a decision that could reshape not just this case but the rules of Hollywood publicity itself. For Blake, the stakes are existential, because her career has been built on an image of professionalism and grace, and if that image is tainted by whispers of unreliability, of being difficult, it could close doors in an industry that trades on reputation as much as talent. While for Baldoni, the risk is equally severe, because if the court buys Blake's framing, he could be branded not as a savvy promoter but as a retaliator, a label that in today's climate of accountability could haunt his career and projects for years to come. And so the courtroom becomes the stage on which Hollywood's oldest trick, selling scandal, collides with its newest challenge, the demand for accountability, and the outcome may decide whether stars can continue to be casualties of PR wars without legal recourse, or whether the courts will finally draw a line, saying that beyond a certain point, gossip is no longer marketing but harassment. This razor's edge is what makes the case so riveting, because it is not merely about the rights of one actress but about the power dynamics of an entire industry, and it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How much of what we consume as news about celebrities is actually orchestrated? And when does that orchestration become something darker, something punitive? The irony, of course, is that the courtroom itself is now part of the spectacle. The filings and hearings feeding the same media machine that Blake accuses of retaliating against her. So that even as she seeks justice, she is caught in the cycle of spin, her claims generating headlines, Baldoni's responses generating counter-headlines, and the public left to sift through a fog of narratives in which truth and PR blur, until they are nearly indistinguishable. And perhaps that is the most damning revelation of all, that in Hollywood, the line between a smear and a strategy is not just thin but invisible, and until a judge draws it clearly, the industry will continue to operate in this gray zone, where reputations rise and fall not on facts but on perception, and where the question is never simply what happened but how it was spun. And so as the case teeters on this precipice, the world watches, wondering whether Blake will succeed in piercing the veil of publicity to expose retaliation, or whether Baldoni will persuade the court that what she calls persecution was nothing more than promotion, a story as old as Hollywood itself, but now for the first time tested under the unforgiving glare of the law. As the trial pressed deeper into its third act, the narrative shifted from being merely a contest of legal interpretation into a sprawling war over image, perception, and the currency of reputation in Hollywood, because by now both sides understood that this was no longer simply about statutes or precedents, but about who could convince the world, both inside and outside the courtroom, that their story was the truer one, the more credible one, the one that history itself would remember. And in this sense, part 3 of the saga becomes almost Shakespearean, a tale of two reputations colliding in a crucible of law and media, with Blake Lively fighting desperately to preserve her standing as a respected actress, professional collaborator, and symbol of elegance, while Justin Baldoni struggles to shield himself from being branded a manipulator who weaponized publicity not for art or business but for vengeance. And this clash forces us to examine not just the mechanics of law but the machinery of image-making itself, because in Hollywood, perception is often the only reality that matters, and the courts themselves cannot entirely escape its gravitational pull. Blake's lawyers continued to drive home the argument that the stream of negative coverage she faced was neither accidental nor incidental, but the product of a calculated strategy, one designed to punish her for speaking out, to send a warning to others who might dare to challenge powerful figures in the industry. And they drew connections between the timing of her legal assertions and the sudden uptick in stories labeling her difficult or unprofessional, arguing that no studio or PR department would waste precious publicity cycles on such negativity unless it served a deeper purpose. And in their telling, that purpose was retaliation, pure and simple, an effort to isolate her within the industry, to taint her brand, and to remind her of the consequences of daring to resist. Meanwhile, Baldoni's defense doubled down on the argument that everything being painted as malicious was, in fact, textbook marketing, that Hollywood thrives on tension, thrives on the spectacle of conflict, that fans and journalists alike devour tales of discord on set, feuds between stars and supposed diva antics, and that these stories are not punishments but promotions, designed not to destroy but to entice, to draw attention, to build narratives that keep audiences talking long enough to buy tickets. And they argued that to treat such tactics as retaliation would be to criminalize an industry practice that has existed for decades, one so ingrained in the culture of Hollywood that no film could be marketed without it. And to outlaw it now would be akin to declaring gossip itself illegal, an absurd proposition in a country that enshrines free speech. Yet as persuasive as this argument may sound, it fails to account for the uniquely personal nature of what Blake describes, because she is not simply pointing to broad publicity stunts or playful feuds, but to stories that cut to the heart of her professional identity, suggesting she is unreliable, untrustworthy, difficult to work with, accusations that in Hollywood can have devastating long-term effects, because the industry, for all its glamour, remains a tightly knit network where reputation determines opportunity. And once you are labeled toxic, offers dry up, calls stop coming, and careers collapse in silence. And so Blake's team argued that what was being passed off as just business was, in fact, something much darker. A surgical attempt to cripple her future. The judge, caught between these two narratives, now faced an impossible balance. How to protect free speech and the accepted norms of publicity, without allowing them to become shields for retaliation. How to recognize the right of studios and producers to shape narratives without giving them unchecked power to destroy reputations under the guise of marketing. And it is in this delicate, balancing act that the case gained its historic weight, because the ruling would not only decide the fate of Blake and Baldoni, but potentially reshape how Hollywood operates, forcing publicists, studios, and stars alike to rethink the ethics of publicity campaigns that tread perilously close to personal attacks. But beyond the courtroom battles and legal nuances, what made Part 3 particularly compelling was the emotional toll it revealed, because beneath the filings and arguments were two human beings caught in a spiral of accusations, each claiming betrayal, each convinced of their own righteousness, and the toll on their personal lives was becoming evident, with Blake portrayed as weary, frustrated, and at times visibly shaken by the weight of what she described as a smear designed to break her, while Baldoni, though outwardly composed, was increasingly painted by the press as a man fighting not only for legal vindication, but for his own image as a decent and principled filmmaker, and it became clear that no matter who won in court, both would leave scarred in ways that the law could never fully heal. This is where the larger themes began to crystallize. The clash between free expression and accountability, between publicity as a tool and publicity as a weapon, between Hollywood's culture of spin and the emerging demand for justice and responsibility, and in many ways, this trial symbolized the broader cultural reckoning taking place in entertainment, a reckoning that asked whether the old rules of gossip as marketing could survive in an era where reputational harm carries real consequences, where social media amplifies every rumor to deafening proportions, and where stars are no longer passive subjects of the system, but active participants in shaping their narratives. For Blake, the case was about drawing a line in the sand, saying that enough was enough, that no amount of business as usual could justify the personal devastation she endured, while for Baldoni, the fight was about defending the very fabric of an industry he insisted was built on the interplay of art, publicity, and spectacle, and he feared that if the court sided with Blake, the result would be a chilling effect that paralyzed studios, silenced promoters, and stifled the very energy that made Hollywood thrive. And so, as closing arguments approached, the atmosphere was electric with tension, not only because of the immediate outcome but because everyone, from journalists to fellow actors, from executives to audiences, knew that the decision would echo far beyond this case, setting a precedent that could either embolden other stars to challenge the machine or reassure studios that their strategies remained legally untouchable. And in this way, the courtroom became less a forum for resolving one dispute, and more a theater for the future of Hollywood itself. The irony, of course, is that even as both sides decried the use of publicity as a weapon, they each continued to wage their own PR wars outside the courthouse, with Blake's allies giving carefully framed interviews about her professionalism and kindness, while Baldoni's camp whispered to industry outlets about his integrity and vision. And so the very dynamic at the heart of the case, publicity as battleground, played out in real time, proving that in Hollywood, even justice cannot escape the gravitational pull of spin. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of Part 3, that in the collision between law and publicity, no one remains untouched, because every claim, every denial, every whispered rumor becomes part of the narrative, feeding the same machine that both sustains and devours its stars. And until someone breaks the cycle, Hollywood will remain locked in this paradox, where image is everything and truth is whatever can be sold most convincingly to the world. In the hushed anticipation of a courtroom where every whispered remark and every subtle gesture carried the weight of careers, reputations, and Hollywood's future balance of power, the stage was set for what many were calling the final act of a drama that had blurred the lines between legal reality, public theater, and the merciless rhythm of celebrity culture. Because as the cameras remained fixed on the courthouse steps and pundits filled airwaves with feverish speculation, what lingered in everyone's mind was not simply whether Blake Lively could salvage her claim of retaliation, or whether Justin Baldoni's sleek legal maneuvers would snuff out the case before it breathed, but rather how the verdict, whatever its form, would ripple outward through the entertainment industry, shifting contracts, silencing or empowering voices, and setting precedents that future stars and studios alike would not be able to ignore. And so in part 4 of this unfolding saga, we must pull back the velvet curtain and examine the looming possibilities, because the truth is that in law, as in cinema, endings are rarely clean or simple, they are layered with implication, echoing across the very culture that consumes them. And the looming judgment here is no exception, for in one scenario the judge accepts Baldoni's cold, technical strike, the motion for judgment on the pleadings, and declares with an almost clinical detachment that even if every word in Blake's filing were true, it does not amount to a legally cognizable claim. And with the stroke of a gavel the lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice, slamming shut every possible door, denying discovery, forbidding refiling, and forever marking her grievance as one that never crossed the threshold of legitimacy in the eyes of the law. And in that outcome Blake Lively, whose image has for years been entwined with glamour, confidence, and carefully polished stardom, finds herself cast not as a victorious truth-teller, but as a celebrity. In the hushed anticipation of a courtroom where every whispered remark and every subtle gesture carried the weight of careers, reputations, and Hollywood's future balance of power, the stage was set for what many were calling the final act of a drama that had blurred the lines between legal reality, public theater, and the merciless rhythm of celebrity culture. Because as the cameras remained fixed on the courthouse steps and pundits filled airwaves with feverish speculation, what lingered in everyone's mind was not simply whether Blake Lively could salvage her claim of retaliation, or whether Justin Baldoni's sleek legal maneuvers would snuff out the case before it breathed, but rather how the verdict, whatever its form, would ripple outward through the entertainment industry, shifting contracts, silencing or empowering voices, and setting precedents that future stars and studios alike would not be able to ignore. And so in part 4 of this unfolding saga, we must pull back the velvet curtain and examine the looming possibilities, because the truth is that in law, as in cinema, endings are rarely clean or simple, they are layered with implication, echoing across the very culture that consumes them. And the looming judgment here is no exception, for in one scenario the judge accepts Baldoni's cold, technical strike, the motion for judgment on the pleadings, and declares with an almost clinical detachment that even if every word in Blake's filing were true, it does not amount to a legally cognizable claim. And with the stroke of a gavel the lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice, slamming shut every possible door, denying discovery, forbidding refiling, and forever marking her grievance as one that never crossed the threshold of legitimacy in the eyes of the law. And in that outcome Blake Lively, whose image has for years been entwined with glamour, confidence, and carefully polished stardom, finds herself cast not as a victorious truth-teller, but as a celebrity. Celebrity whose complaints evaporated in the sterile air of legal definitions. Her supporters left wondering if the system had protected power at the expense of fairness. Her detractors emboldened to sneer that she had overreached, dramatized, and been put in her place. Yet if the judge resists that invitation, if the motion fails, then the doors to discovery swing wide open, and suddenly emails, texts, and testimony are no longer whispers on gossip blogs but evidence on the record, capable of reshaping careers and reputations in real time. And Baldoni, who has spent months framing himself as merely a participant in standard Hollywood PR, could find those internal communications painting him as something far less benign, with intent and strategy exposed in black and white. And then the case becomes not just a skirmish over legal definitions, but a prolonged war with reputational casualties mounting by the day. And yet even this binary framing, victory for Justin through dismissal or survival for Blake through discovery, barely captures the complexity, for hovering over every development is the question of jurisdiction. The duel between California's broad protective statutes and New York's narrower, more employer-friendly framework, because should the court rule that California law applies and Blake skipped a mandatory administrative step, her case may collapse under its own procedural flaws, and should New York law seize control instead, many of the acts she decries may simply fall outside its limited definition of retaliation, thus rendering her cries of sabotage mere noise in legal terms. And so geography itself becomes destiny, with one set of statutes offering her a fighting chance and the other rendering her claims toothless. And this uncertainty creates an eerie atmosphere in which neither side can confidently predict their survival. and the judge's eventual ruling becomes a kind of dice roll with consequences stretching far beyond this one pair of. Not and a tarnished reputation, even if unjustified, can quietly shut doors, while for Justin Baldoni, a dismissal strengthens his image as both savvy and resilient, a man who outmaneuvered a powerful opponent not with theatrics but with sharp lawyering, and yet reputations cut both ways, for the very act of moving to silence her claim so aggressively could, in some corners, paint him as a man with something to hide, a manipulator who won on a technicality rather than a vindication of innocence, and public opinion, unpredictable as always, may turn either of them into villain or martyr regardless of the judge's reasoning, so that in the theater of celebrity, even legal triumphs can feel pyrrhic, and this tension points us towards the broader fallout. How the industry itself will react when the dust settles, because already insiders whisper that contracts are being rewritten, clauses tightened, and studios quietly consulting employment lawyers to anticipate whether publicity tactics once thought harmless could land them in court, and agents advising their clients to document communications, safeguard evidence, and prepare for a world where PR retaliation becomes as recognized a concept as harassment or discrimination. And should Blake survive the early motions and push into discovery, the fear of private communications leaking may drive settlement talks, with studios desperate to avoid precedent-setting rulings, while should she be dismissed, activists and workers' advocates may seize upon her loss as a rallying cry for legislative reform, urging California or even federal lawmakers to expand definitions of retaliation to include reputational sabotage disguised as PR, thus turning her courtroom defeat into the seed of political change. And still another layer emerges when one considers the personal toll, for Blake, a mother and a global icon, would have to navigate the collision of private vulnerability and public scrutiny, balancing the dignity of moving forward with the sting of a legal door slammed in her face, while Justin, whose career trajectory has included both acting and directing, risks being forever tagged with the shadow of this fight, his accomplishments always accompanied by the asterisk of controversy, and together their battle illustrates the dangerous double bind of modern celebrity, that the very tools of promotion and image building can so easily become evidence in court, and that every whisper, every planted story, every interview, quip can be reframed years later as proof of retaliation, malice, or calculated harm. And this is why the courtroom showdown has gripped not only gossip outlets but also serious legal minds, because it embodies the clash between free expression and workplace protection, between the machinery of publicity and the dignity of the individual, between the myth of Hollywood and the machinery of law. And as we speculate on verdicts, we must acknowledge that no matter which way the gavel falls, the consequences are permanent. For even if the lawsuit vanishes, the questions it raised cannot be unasked, and industry players will remember the risk, recalibrate their strategies, and alter the culture of how stars are managed, marketed, and disciplined, so that in the end this saga may not be remembered solely for who won or lost, but for how it redefined the rules of engagement in an industry built on both illusion and control. And so as the judge prepares to render a decision, what hangs in the balance is not simply Blake Lively's case but the very architecture of Hollywood's future battles, where the line between PR and retaliation, between narrative and sabotage, will be drawn not on glossy magazine covers but in the dense, technical pages of court rulings, rulings that will echo long after the headlines fade, shaping careers, shaping contracts, shaping the very stories that tomorrow's stars will dare to tell. And that is why this final act is not truly an ending but a hinge point. Thanks for watching. Subscribe my channel Coravanta for more updates. With Sardar Zuriat Abbas Khan Lashari.